Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new edition of our Connecting East and West podcast. With me, your host, Luis Alberto Pino. Connecting East and West is an initiative by East Consulting, the leading business and legal advisory firm bridging businesses between Asia and Latin America. Connecting East and West is your space dedicated to bringing helpful ideas and high-caliber views on the business and overall relationship landscape between Asia and Latin America. Connecting East and West by East Consulting is your partner to connect and make the most out of both regions. And I'm sure you're going to enjoy the next few minutes with today's guest, Maria Adele Carrai, who is an associate professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations and in the Oxford School of Global and Area Studies at the University of Oxford. Her research examines the history of international law in East Asia and investigates how China's rise as a global power shapes norms and reconfigures the international order, with particular interest in sovereignty, extraterritoriality, and digital governance. She's the author of Sovereignty in China, a genealogy of concept since 1840, and the forthcoming China's normative power in cyberspace. She co-edited the China Questions 2, Critical Insights into U.S China Relations and the Cambridge History of International Law in Asia. Maria Adele is the founder and executive director of Mapping Global China, a research initiative that combines data and storytelling to build public-facing maps, datasets, and narrative outputs to better understand China's global presence. This project has received support from the British Academy, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Ford Foundation, and New York University, including NYU in Shanghai, China. We're going to be talking about this. So, Adele, welcome to Connecting East and West. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Luis, for having me here. It's an honor and a pleasure.
Okay, so Adele, I always like to know somewhat further about the motivations of our guests, right? So you are Italian, you are an Italian national and a prestigious sinologist. So where does your interest in China come from? Is there any special or personal connection with China that has fueled your interest in that country throughout your life?
So sure. So my interest in China started at a more personal level. I grew up in a small town in Italy called Cesena, and I became fascinated by China when a Chinese restaurant opened in the main square of my town, and I became friends with the owner's daughter. And I will spend a lot of time there eating with them, and I was just very charmed. And I began studying Chinese at 18 years old, so that was a short story. Then they left, but it kind of triggered something in me. And then at 18, I started to study Chinese in Rome. I went to Beijing and China, Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Wuhan as well, before it was famous. And over time, I think that my central question became, how does China rise transform the international order, not only through formal diplomacy, but also through law, companies, infrastructure, technology. And so that also what led me to create this Mapping Global China research initiative. And
I'm going to ask you about that specifically just in a few seconds. So everything began with a restaurant. Interesting.
And food, exactly. I'm Italian, so around the table. It started around the table. Yeah.
Okay, as many other things, right? Okay, so let me now ask you about your project, right? The one that you're carrying out right now, Mapping Global China. So in essence, what is this project about, and what are the objectives that you are pursuing with this initiative?
Mm-hmm. So Mapping Global China, it's a research initiative that brings together different scholars from different disciplines and try to promote a better database and story-based understanding of global China that goes beyond what we generally hear of China as a threat, China as a possible savior of everything. So we have narratives that are very different, and the truth is probably in between, but is not well told. And so we're trying to bring together these people and also data sets so that people from like students, journalists, policymakers can have easy access in one place on data related to China, and good scholars, the practitioners that work with China.
And how is it going in terms of the usage by your target audiences?
Yeah, so it's going very well also because we're phasing its launch. And so we launched a draft kind of website in February before a workshop, the first workshop to launch the initiative took place in Oxford. And the workshop itself went very well. And the website new launch, official launch, will take place in September, but we already have something online to so that people get a sense of what the initiative is about. We have, I think now 7 research clusters working on different aspects of China global presence. We just finalized a postdoc that will be in Oxford working with us and the team on narratives of China and how it's shaping media discourse outside of China. So I would say that it's going very well given the limited financial sources that we have. We do have support, but it's limited. I think we're doing a lot and we're growing. And I'm very excited about what's next about mapping global China. And we have also a workshop coming up, one in Tashkent in Uzbekistan, and another one in Rio de Janeiro in December, and another one in New York on City. So it's growing, I would say. It's growing, and I'm happy of its direction.
Excellent, excellent. So let's talk now about China and Latin America, Adele. Chinese investment in Latin America is actively diversifying from traditional natural resource extraction toward kind of high-tech industrial segments, clean energy, electric mobility, and strategic infrastructure. While commodities still dominate, right? Greenfield projects now seem to be driving Beijing's strategy in Latin America. And we're seeing this very clearly in several countries. So against this backdrop, what are your views on how China's presence in Latin America has unfolded over the years? In other words, if you had to choose 2 or 3 main features as to the way the Chinese has set foot on this region, what those features would be?
Sure. So I think that one of the first major acceleration that followed China joining the World Trade Organizations in 2001. After that, trade expanded very rapidly and was mainly driven by Chinese demand for commodities and Latin American demand for very cheap or cheaper priced manufactured goods. And countries such as Brazil, Chile, and Peru became a very important supplier of soybeans, copper, and other important resources for China growth. And then another important moment, I would say, is following the global financial crisis, especially in the early 2010s, when the relationship between China and Latin America expanded. And Chinese policy banks became very important lenders, especially to countries that had difficulty assessing other more Western or more traditional international capital markets. And also at this point, I think Chinese companies start to move into energy, mining, transport, and telecommunication. But now I think so. We're witnessing a third phase, a new transition. And so we have large sovereign lending has declined from its earlier peak, but China has not moved away. And the relationship instead is becoming much more diverse and increasingly driven by companies, also private companies, especially private companies. And I think investments are moving more toward renewable energy, electricity transmission, critical minerals that are a very important component of China presence, and supply chain, global supply chain that China dominates. And overall, though, I would say that trade has remained asymmetric. And so Latin America export commodities or relatively low value added goods and imports increasingly goods that are much more sophisticated and expensive from China. So I think that's a overall picture. I would say the 3 points.
Excellent. Let me Let's try to elaborate further on these three points in a way. Do you have dedicated a big chunk of your career to researching China's internationalization strategy? What would you say have been the distinctive traits of this strategy in broad terms? And more specifically, what space would you say Latin America has occupied so far vis-a-vis other regions, such as, for example, Southeast Asia or Africa, which you have studied as well? So what would be, in your view, the particularities of Latin America against the backdrop of this overall Chinese internationalization strategy that you have pointed out right now?
Yeah. So I would say that when we look at China internationalization strategy, we need to consider not just the strategic geopolitical consideration, which exists, but also the driver from like private companies, like commercial drivers, and some investment that took place in the past in Latin America try to access resources, including, again, copper, lithium, and all this rare earth mineral, iron, agricultural commodities, other six markets, because Latin America, if compared to other places like Africa, it has a large urban populations and growing demand for electric vehicles, for instance, or telecommunication, digital services, and consumer products. And then some other project contributed to the integration of supply chain with China. That said, so this is more kind of market-related aspect, but then there is also the strategic geopolitical consideration, and for instance, energy systems, port, telecommunications, and critical minerals have implications that expand beyond the mere kind of the pure commercial aspects. But again, even in those sectors, we have to be careful in implying a strategic logic of China wanting to take over, supply chain. That for sure, there is a combination of the two because of the nature of Chinese state. But you need to kind of diversify. And then related to the other question you asked about the difference between Latin America versus other countries, I think Latin America plays a different role in China's internationalization. So for instance, if you look at Southeast Asia, it's much more deeply connected to Chinese manufacturing network because of the geographical proximity, right? And you cannot escape that despite all this connectivity with boats, whatever, and planes. But also culturally, historically, there's much more connection between Southeast Asia and China. In Africa, instead, it's important for infrastructure construction to test some of the models that China then expanded abroad. Latin America is the most distant between like Africa or Southeast Asia, but is also very strategic for critical minerals, for food security as well. I was mentioning before soybeans, meat, and so forth. And also China entering Latin America often encounters companies that are much more established than companies, for instance, in Africa. It encounters courts, law that is different and much more sophisticated and developed than other places, for instance, in Africa, or environmental regulations and civil society that is better organized than other places. So that I think it's a bit of a different. Another important aspect of Latin America is its proximity, not to China, but to the United States. And so commercial activities that might attract limited geopolitical attention elsewhere, here becomes a very hot spot, like Panama Canal, right? If Panama Canal was somewhere else, probably would have not raised so much scrutiny from the United States. And so I think that different regions serve different functions, and we need to keep in mind the logics that of the internationalization of China. So there is commercial that is driven very often by private companies, and then there is the more state-driven logic, and the different reality, the different regions that have kind of how to say, a articulation that is different, if you want, between all these different regions.
I understand. You have mentioned already several times the Chinese private companies, right? Let me ask you specifically about that. Have you seen significant changes in the, typology of the Chinese companies themselves? I mean, how they work, and especially how they relate to the Chinese state, right? So, many people say, or question how private Chinese companies actually are, right? So, in your view, can you, what are your views as to the Chinese companies in particular? Have you seen, progress or significant changes, over quite a few years in Latin America and other regions as well?
Yeah, so overall, because China, promoted the Chuhai or Zhou like that's internationalization from the late 90s. And at the beginning, there were a lot of state-owned enterprises and smaller private companies. Nowadays, you have private companies giants that, and the issue is always the relationship with the state, because they're private, but usually they have members of the Chinese Communist Party inside. To go outside, to move capital even from China abroad, you have to convert renminbi in other currency. And so the state still has a big say, even if you're a private company. And I guess, the transformation is that companies today are much more international, global. There are differences, but like you go and talk to a counterpart, they are completely very well versed in international law, legal aspects, the culture of another country, so that they know better. Like they're no longer the first people going out, not really understanding the system, but they're very advanced, extremely advanced, very well versed with globalization, capital system, and so forth. They're a good counterpart. They're at the level, if not even higher. Yeah, sophisticated. They're very sophisticated private company, very powerful and advanced.
Okay, got it. And then the Chinese have launched a number of global initiatives to help project influence, and we all know this, counteract U.S.'s power worldwide, right? So there's a lot of geopolitics on this front. These include the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, the Global Civilization Initiative, and the Global Governance Initiative. Perhaps we should also add the Belt and Road Initiative to this list, right? So last week alone, China launched the World AI Cooperation Organization, and Chinese AI models, we know, are performing almost as well as US models in terms of artificial intelligence, right? So what's your take on the results of these big scale programs, particularly in Latin America?
Yeah, of these initiatives.
Yeah.
So, first we need to understand what these initiatives are, and sometimes are very much of a label attached to things that already existed, but it helps catalyze support from other countries. It helps unite all the different efforts, entrepreneurs, private, public, etc., toward one shared goal. And the Belt and Road Initiative, it's the key initiative, right? That showed Xi Jinping desire to globalize. Like this is the first really big initiative of China going global. And in terms of its relationship with Latin America, it came a bit late, because originally, until 2017, the Belt and Road was really much more focused on Eurasia. So it was the idea to connect Beijing to Europe, the biggest market. Then gradually from 2017, it started to expand to all over the world and to the outer space, the planetary initiative almost. And became an umbrella for China expanding relationship also with Latin America and the Caribbean countries. And now I think that more than 20 countries in the region have joined the Belt and Road Initiative. Panama withdrew. So there are some countries that withdrew, like Italy. I'm Italian, and so also Italy took part and then withdrew from it. And in terms of achievement, they should not be measured simply by counting all this memorandum of understanding, because joining the Belt and Road doesn't necessarily bring more benefit or more investments. And that was the case also in Italy, that we joined the memorandum of understanding to support the Belt and Road, and then France got much more investments and deals with China than Italy. But BRI, as nevertheless, as all these other initiatives, I think in particular BRI, I can talk with some authority because I've worked on that for many years. So in terms of its functions, it had supply and overarching, again, political narrative. It facilitated also some high-level contacts between Latin America and China, and also open opportunities, new opportunities for Chinese companies, because this is also led from the top. And so it facilitated this kind of connectivity and South-South cooperation. And in terms of its record, and again, this is a big umbrella. It includes everything Chinese in Latin America. The results is mixed, and some projects have definitely improved transportation, energy generation, or digital connectivity, while others have been criticized because they've been delayed, they've been renegotiated, they cause environmental issues or social issues, and so forth. So the experience varies enormously by country and sector. And this is true all over the world. So it's like very fragmented. You cannot say, oh, BRI is good, BRI is bad. First of all, what is BRI? And that is problematic. And also, one last thing about BRI is that it's also changing itself. And so we're seeing less big project, but more small and beautiful. So much more attention in theory to social and environmental issues. But again, this has to be seen and studied. And another point that I would like to make for our Latin American listeners and any other listeners is that the key question for Belt and Road Initiative is not whether it's inherently beneficial or not, or threatening for a country, but it is also whether the government, the recipient government, can translate this Chinese engagement into local value creation. So employment, skills, technology transfer, economic diversification, and sustainable infrastructure. So it's a lot on the recipient countries, I believe, to make the most of this label, big narrative frame that also channels some money and, diplomatic exchanges.
Perfect. Okay, so let's talk now about China and the U.S. in particular, right? That's so key relationship for us all in the world. So we're all witnessing the rising uncertainties of the U.S. presence in Latin America, notably when it comes to investment in strategic sectors. The White House may regard sensitive from a national standpoint. For example, enabling infrastructure for digital connection and data transfer, AI, and several others. The so-called Don't Road Doctrine, right?
Yeah.
So all this is playing out while China continues to strive to make inroads into Latin American markets and keep building up influence as much as this is still possible. So how do you think the China-US race will specifically unfold in Latin America going forward?
Yeah, sure. So I want to talk about this framing, so the so-called Don't Road Doctrine that represents an effort by the Trump administration to revive a sphere of influence understanding of the Western Hemisphere, with China now occupying a position that was once assigned to European powers under the original Monroe Doctrine. And so the rivalry is particularly evident around ports, maritime routes, critical minerals, telecommunication networks, and other big infrastructure investment that can affect national security and, U.S. Indirectly. And the Panama Canal, for instance, has become a big symbol of this rivalry, right? And is a port. But also now the U.S. is also focusing very much on critical materials, so access to these critical materials, and China is leading in that, also in Latin America. But I think that the language of exclusive sphere of influence creates problems. At least we have two problems here. One is that China's economic relationship with Latin America is now too deeply embedded to be simply removed from the picture. And China is a major trading partner for many countries, and Chinese companies supply finances, infrastructure, technology that the local economy also demand, and that the US cannot just replace. And then another issue with this framing is that it denies Latin America countries agency. Like we always see, oh, Latin America is this field, this empty field where there is influence that is projected by US and now by China. But government in the region do not necessarily want to choose also between Washington and Beijing, and they have their own agency, and they want to diversify partnership, negotiate better terms, and use competitors to expand their options, or at least that should be the goal of the two. What I said before, the government really should make the most of what comes from China, including its presence as a kind of bargaining chip with the US potentially. And so the US has legitimate security concern, but it cannot pressure without offering economic benefit to these countries. And so I think if Washington wants to remain the preferred partner, it must provide new investments, infrastructure, market access, infrastructure finance, and not just simply ask countries to exclude China. And this we've seen in other countries that, they don't just follow the US, especially now. There's been a lot of questioning of the direction the US has taken. And also at the same time, I think that Latin American countries should not romanticize China as a ideal and uncomplicated alternative. And they really need strong procurement system, environmental protection, and a credible long-term engagement to really make the most of this relationship.
Excellent. And in connection with this, Adele, this is my last question. Some experts have pointed out that China views the global competition with the US as a race to provide public goods, right? Public goods at a speed and a scale. And of course, this is in addition to its narrative presenting the US as a declining power, lashing out everywhere, right? So do you agree with this view?
That China is the public provider of goods versus, and this is how it's been framed. I think so, and it's how it's been perceived. I remember when I went to Africa to do some field work, or even talking to other stakeholders in Central Asia, Latin America, and all over the world, they see China as a country that actually provides goods. We need roads, we need infrastructures. These other people just talk. I still remember when I was in Kenya, I went to the Ministry of Finance, and then I went to the China desk. There was this Kenya, no, actually it was in Ethiopia, not in Kenya. And the person was mentioning, oh, here's the USAID. They're just talking under a very expensive chandelier, like in the hotel, but they're not really resolving any of our issues. So this is definitely the perception a bit of China, but there is also awareness that, again, it's not an uncomplicated partner, and you have to be careful because it comes with certain strings attached, different kind of conditionality than Western countries used to pose, but like dependencies question. And, this is also goes back to the domestic politics of a country. And China has provided amazing material infrastructure to its people. I mean, I don't know if you've ever been to China. I think everybody should go and see with their own eyes. It's amazing. Subways, trains, airports that are amazing, streets, everything is all the things are functioning. You are in the US and we are in this democratic system that has so many gridlocks, and nobody has the authority to create the common good, to bring about the common good. We have so much money, and yet we cannot extend one subway stop, the New York subway, or create a decent train connecting San Francisco to Los Angeles. How can you do that abroad? Like if also your system within it's not really functioning, how can you provide common good? And this is again is a problem that also goes back to the domestic politics, right? And really make us think about, democratic systems that are more authoritarian, and really how can we be effective in providing common goods that people want? And that brings you credibility domestically. Like, we want someone that just build the road, and the same is true internationally. So that also maybe can address the question of regime, right? Because China is often a different regime type than others. But if you provide common goods and people are happy, you see that, you use them, you benefit from it, that's extremely powerful.
Okay, well, I've been to China actually, and I've seen all the things that you have just pointed out. Indeed. Okay, Adele, thank you very much. We've come to the end of our episode. I think you have walked us through all the most significant aspects of the relationship between China, or the way China's presence is visible for us here in Latin America. So thank you so much. I hope you have enjoyed also the conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, and best of luck with your great podcast.
Thank you. And to all of our followers, don't miss out on the next episode of Connecting East and West, in which we will continue to explore the business and relationship landscape between Asia and Latin America. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.